Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of Early Kings of Norway by Thomas Carlyle. Chapter 3, Hakon the Good.
Eric Bloodaxe, whose practical reign is counted to have begun about AD 930, had by this time, or within a year or so of this time, pretty much extinguished all his brother kings and crushed down recalcitrant spirits in his violent way, but had naturally become entirely unpopular in Norway and filled it with silent discontent and even rage against him. Hakon Fairhair's last son, the little foster child of Athelstan in England, who had been baptized and carefully educated, was come to his 14th or 15th year at his father's death, a very shining youth, as Athelstan saw with just pleasure. So soon as the few preliminary preparations had been settled, Hakon, furnished with a ship or two by Athelstan, suddenly appeared in Norway, got acknowledged by the peasant thing in Trondheim, the news of which flew over Norway, like fire through dried grass, says an old chronicler, so that Eric, with his queen Gunhild and 7 small children, had to run, no other shift for Eric. They went to the Orkneys first of all, then to England, and he got Northumberland as earldom, I vaguely hear from Athelstan. But Eric soon died, and his queen with her children went back to the Orkneys in search of refuge or help, to little purpose there or elsewhere. From Orkney she went to Denmark, where Harald Bluetooth took her poor eldest boy as foster child, but I fear did not very faithfully keep that promise. The Danes had been robbing extensively during the late tumults in Norway. This the Christian Hakon, now established there, paid in kind, and the two countries were at war, so that Gunhild's little boy was a welcome card in the hand of Bluetooth. Hakon proved a brilliant and successful king, regulated many things, public law among others, Gulthing law, Frosthing law. These are little codes of his accepted by their respective things, and had a salutary effect in their time. With prompt dexterity he drove back the Bluetooth foster-son invasions every time they came, and on the whole gained for himself the name of Hakon the Good. These Danish invasions were a frequent source of trouble to him, but his greatest and continual trouble was that of extirpating heathen idolatry from Norway and introducing the Christian evangel in its stead. His transcendent anxiety to achieve this salutary enterprise was all along his grand difficulty and stumbling block, the heathen opposition to it being also rooted and great. Bishops and priests from England Hakon had, preaching and baptizing what they could, but making only slow progress, much too slow for Hakon's zeal. On the other hand, every Yuletide, when the chief heathen were assembled in his own palace on their grand sacrificial festival, there was great pressure put upon Hakon as to sprinkling with horse blood, drinking Yule beer, eating horse flesh, and the other distressing rites, the whole of which Hakon abhorred, and with all his steadfastness strove to reject utterly. Sigurd, Jarl of Lade, Trondheim, a liberal heathen, not openly a Christian, was ever a wise counselor and conciliator in such affairs, and proved of great help to Hakon. Once, for example, there having risen at a Yule feast, loud, almost stormful demand that Hakon, like a true man and brother, should drink Yule beer with them in their sacred hightide, Sigurd persuaded him to comply, for peace's sake at least in form. Hakon took the cup in his left hand, excellent hot beer, and with his right cut the sign of the cross above it, then drank a draught. "Yes, but what is this with the king's right hand?" cried the company. "Don't you see?" answered shifty Sigurd. "He makes the sign of Thor's hammer before drinking, which quenched the matter for the time. Horse flesh, horse broth, and the horse ingredient generally, Hakon all but inexorably declined. By Sigurd's pressing exhortation and entreaty, he did once take a kettle of horse broth by the handle, with a good deal of linen quilt or towel interposed, and did open his lips for what of steam could insinuate itself. At another time he consented to a particle of horse liver, intending privately, I guess, to keep it outside the gullet, and smuggle it away without swallowing, but farther than this not even Sigurd could persuade him to go. At the things held in regard to this matter, Hakon's success was always incomplete. Now and then it was plain failure, and Hakon had to draw back till a better time. Here is one specimen of the response he got on such an occasion. Curious specimen, withal, of antique parliamentary eloquence from an anti-Christian thing. At a thing of all the fylkes of Trondheim, Thing held at Frost in that region, King Hakon, with all the eloquence he had, signified that it was imperatively necessary that all bonders and sub-bonders should become Christians and believe in one God, Christ the Son of Mary. Renouncing entirely blood sacrifices and heathen idols, should keep every seventh day holy, abstain from labor that day, and even from food, devoting the day to fasting and sacred meditation. Whereupon, by way of universal answer, arose a confused universal murmur of entire dissent. "Take away from us our old belief, and also our time for labor," murmured they in angry astonishment. "How can even the land be got tilled in that way?" "We cannot work if we don't get food," said the hand laborers and slaves. "It lies in King Hakon's blood," remarked others. His father and all his kindred were apt to be stingy about food, though liberal enough with money. At length, one Osbjorn, or bear of the Asin or gods, what we now call Osborne, one Osbjorn of Medalhusing Gulathal, stepped forward and said in a distinct manner, "We bonders, peasant proprietors, thought, King Hakon, when thou heldest thy first Thing Day here in Trondhjem, and we took thee for our king, and received our hereditary lands from thee again, that we had got heaven itself. But now we know not how it is, whether we have won freedom, or whether thou intendest anew to make us slaves, with this wonderful proposal that we should renounce our faith, which our fathers before us have held, and all our ancestors as well, first in the age of burial by burning, and now in that of earth burial. And yet these departed ones were much our superiors, and their faith too has brought prosperity to us. Thee at the same time we have loved so much that we raised thee to manage all the laws of the land, and speak as their voice to us all. And even now it is our will, and the vote of all bonders, to keep that paction which thou gavest us here on the Thing at Froste, and to maintain thee as king so long as any of us bonders who are here upon the Thing has life left, provided thou, king, wilt go fairly to work, and demand of us only such things as are not impossible. But if thou wilt fix upon this thing with so great obstinacy, and employ force and power, in that case we bonders have taken the resolution, all of us, to fall away from thee, and to take for ourselves another head, who will so behave that we may enjoy in freedom the belief which is agreeable to us. Now shalt thou, king, choose one of these two courses before the Thing disperse. Whereupon, adds the chronicle, all the bonders raised a mighty shout, "Yes, we will have it so, as has been said," so that Jarl Sigurd had to intervene, and King Hakon to choose for the moment the milder branch of the alternative. At other things, Hakon was more or less successful. All his days, by such methods as there were, he kept pressing forward with this great enterprise, and on the whole did thoroughly shake asunder the old edifice of heathendom, and fairly introduce some foundation for the new and better rule of faith and life among his people. Sigurd, Jarl of Lade, his wise counselor in all these matters, is also a man worthy of notice. Hakon's arrangements against the continual invasions of Eric's sons, with Danish blue tooth backing them, were manifold and for a long time successful. He appointed, after consultation and consent in the various things, so many warships, fully manned and ready, to be furnished instantly on the king's demand by each province or fjord. Watchfires, on fit places, from hill to hill all along the coast, were to be carefully set up, carefully maintained in readiness, and kindled on any alarm of war. By such methods, Bluetooth and Co.'s invasions were for a long while triumphantly, and even rapidly, one and all of them beaten back, till at length they seemed as if intending to cease altogether, and leave Hakon alone of them. But such was not their issue after all. The sons of Eric had only abated under constant discouragement, had not finally left off from what seemed their one great feasibility in life. Gunhild, their mother, was still with them, a most contriving, fierce-minded, irreconcilable woman, diligent and urgent on them, in season and out of season, and as for King Bluetooth, he was at all times ready to help, with his goodwill at least. That of the alarm fires on Hakon's part was found troublesome by his people. Sometimes it was even hurtful and provoking, lighting your alarm fires and rousing the whole coast and population, when it was nothing but some paltry Viking with a couple of ships. In short, the alarm signal system fell into disuse, and good King Hakon himself, in the first place, paid the penalty. It is counted by the latest commentators to have been about AD 961, 16th or 17th year of Hakon's pious, valiant, and worthy reign. Being at a feast one day with many guests on the island of Stord, sudden announcement came to him that ships from the south were approaching in quantity, and evidently ships of war. This was the biggest of all the Bluetooth foster-son invasions, and it was fatal to Hakon the Good that night. Eyvind the Skaldespiller, annihilator of all other skalds, in his famed Hakon's song gives account, and, still more pertinently, the always practical Snorro. Danes in great multitude, 6-1 as people afterwards computed, springing swiftly to land and ranking themselves. Hakon, nevertheless, at once deciding not to take to his ships and run, but to fight there, 1-6, fighting, accordingly, in his most splendid manner and at last gloriously prevailing, routing and scattering back to their ships and flight homeward these 6-1 Danes. During the struggle of the fight, says Snorro, he was very conspicuous among other men, and while the sun shone, his bright gilded helmet glanced, and thereby many weapons were directed at him. One of his henchmen, Eyvind Finnsson, i.e. Skaldespiller, the poet, took a hat and put it over the king's helmet. Now among the hostile first leaders were 2 uncles of the Ericssons, brothers of Gunhild, great champions both. Skreya, the elder of them, on the disappearance of the glittering helmet, shouted boastfully, "Does the king of the Norsemen hide himself then, or has he fled? Where now is the golden helmet?" And so saying, Skreya, and his brother Alf with him, pushed on like fools or madmen. The king said, "Come on in that way, and you shall find the king of the Norsemen." And in a short space of time, braggart Skreya did come up, swinging his sword, and made a cut at the king. But Thorolf the Strong, an Icelander, who fought at the king's side, dashed his shield so hard against Skreya that he tottered with the shock. On the same instant the king takes his sword Quernbiter, able to cut querns or millstones with both hands, and hews Skreya through helm and head, cleaving him down to the shoulders. Thorolf also slew Alf. That was what they got by such over-hasty search for the king of the Norsemen. Snorro considers the fall of these 2 champion uncles as the crisis of the fight, the Danish force being much disheartened by such a sight, and King Hakon now pressing on so hard that all men gave way before him. The battle on the Ericsson part became a whirl of recoil, and in a few minutes more a torrent of mere flight and haste to get on board their ships and put to sea again, in which operation many of them were drowned, says Snorro. Survivors making instant sail for Denmark in that sad condition. This seems to have been King Hakon's finest battle, and the most conspicuous of his victories, due not a little to his own grand qualities shown on the occasion. But alas, it was his last also. He was still zealously directing the chase of that mad Danish flight, or whirl of recoil towards their ships, when an arrow shot in Mempt, most likely at a venture, hit him under the left armpit, and this proved his death. He was helped into his ship and made sail for Alrekstad, where his chief residence in those parts was, but had to stop at a smaller place of his, which had been his mother's, and where he himself was born, a place called Hella, the Flat Rock, still known as Hakon's Hella, faint from loss of blood and crushed down as he had never before felt. Having no son and only one daughter, he appointed these invasive sons of Eric to be sent for, and if he died to become king, but to spare his friends and kindred. "If a longer life be granted me," he said, "I will go out of this land to Christian men, and do penance for what I have committed against God. But if I die in the country of the heathen, let me have such burial as you yourselves think fittest." These are his last recorded words, and in heathen fashion he was buried, and besung by Eyvind and the Skalds, though himself a zealously Christian king. Hakon the Good, so one still finds him worthy of being called. The sorrow on Hakon's death, Snorro tells us, was so great and universal that he was lamented both by friends and enemies, and they said that never again would Norway see such a king.
This concludes today's reading of Early Kings of Norway by Thomas Carlyle. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.